Welcome to today's SuRF webinar. My name is Kyle Waldron. I am a current SuRF board member, and I would like to welcome everybody today to the presentation. So SuRF, also known as Sustainable Remediation Forum, is a nonprofit organization. The mission is to maximize the overall benefit of environmental, societal, and economic benefits for remediation through a number of ways, including advancing the science and application of sustainable remediation, developing best practices, exchanging professional knowledge, and providing education and outreach. And so SuRF is made up of a variety of different folks, from site owners to agencies to academia to consultants to specialty vendors and the public. And so if you'd like more information on SuRF, feel free to visit our website. We actually have a great video there from our UK affiliate that provides a nice overview of the basics of sustainable remediation. And so SuRF has become a kind of this global initiative made up of a variety of chapters and groups that collaborate to share expertise. And so today we're happy to have a speaker from one of our affiliates, the SuRF-UK chapter, to provide us an overview of an upcoming guidance they have developed that will assist you in your sustainability assessment process. So during this presentation, feel free to submit questions using the question chat box on your toolbar in the GoToWebinar function. Go ahead, feel free to submit them anytime during the presentation, and then Paul has a few colleagues with him to answer those questions as we get to the end of his presentation. So our speaker today is Professor Paul Bartos. His background is he's a chartered environmentalist with over 20 years of experience, including over 300 publications. He's currently the managing director of R3, which he established in 1997, and he is also a visiting professor at the University of Reading, has been an adjunct professor at the University of Brighton, and was also a visiting professor at the University of Nottingham for almost 20 years. He's also the co-chair of the steering group for the Sustainable Remediation Forum in the UK, and has authored or contributed to a number of their publications. So with that, I would like to welcome our speaker, Paul. The webinar is yours.
Thank you very much, Kyle. That was a very great introduction, much appreciated. I will make a start now. What I'm going to talk about guidance that we've developed in SuRF-UK that updates something on indicators for sustainable remediation, which we began in 2011. While you can only see my name as an author of this presentation, I have to give a lot of credit to my colleagues in the steering group for SuRF-UK, many consultees who helped us, and in particular Nicola Harris and Hayley Thomas, who are also on this call and will be part of the Q&A session later on. So the contents of my talk will be to tell you about SuRF-UK and where we're coming from, to show you our guidance offer, and then to home in on this, what we call Annex 1 guidance and its headline indicator categories. We will tell you a little bit about our rationale and how the guidance has been used so far. From 2018 to now, we've been updating it, and we'll introduce those updates. And then I'm going to focus really on the indicator categories one by one, and that will be the meat of the presentation, and come to some concluding remarks. And as Kyle has already mentioned, we have an animation on sustainable remediation, And if you'd like to go and have a look at SuRF's website, you can enjoy our animation. So, in a nutshell, SuRF-UK is the United Kingdom Sustainable Remediation Forum, very much inspired by the SuRF that was set up in the States in the early to mid 2000s. We began not long afterwards in 2007, and our goal is to advance the development of sustainable remediation. While you were the first to establish an actual network and an activity, we managed to beat you in the race to putting together a framework. So we published our framework in 2010, shortly before yours. I thought I'd get that one in, I do apologize. We are not a membership network like SuRF in the US. We are a collaborative project that's managed by Claire, which, for those of you who don't know, is the UK's Contaminated Land Knowledge Hub. And it's a project that's a collaboration of many different types of organizations: regulators, industry, consultants, academics, local authorities, to mention a few. If you go to www.claire.co.uk/SuRF-UK, you'll find our guidance offer, and everything that SuRF-UK has produced, like SuRF in the US, is free to download, and you're very welcome to make use of it. We have our overarching guidance framework. We have the original Annex 1, which is going to be withdrawn and replaced by what I'll show you. We have guidance about carrying out sustainability assessment and a wide range of supporting materials. And I guess I might have forgotten to mention the fact that we have this animation. And through this roadmap, which is on the SuRF-UK link, there's lots and lots of information that you can find, and you're very welcome to browse through it. After we produced our framework in 2010, the big question was, well, we understand that sustainability is an important consideration for planning remediation, or indeed planning brownfield projects, but what exactly is it? And how do we make sure that what is being considered is robust and inclusive and transparent to different people who might be using it? So we came up with the idea of reviewing different existing sustainability indicator sets. And from that, and from industry practice and consultations, coming up with a list of what might be indicators of sustainability in our contaminated land management world. And we made a proposal in 2011 of how these indicators might be structured. And we proposed 5 categories within each of the 3 elements of sustainability. And our reason for this was that we wanted to encourage contaminated land practitioners to take a very wide-ranging view of what sustainability comprised. We wanted to make the decision-making more robust by allowing people to take this wide perspective, and we wanted to improve the transparency of assessments by offering everybody the same, although we didn't use the word, but the same checklist of what could be in it. And our idea was also to support framing. By framing, we mean the planning of the sustainability assessment. That can be the same, whether it's a qualitative assessment, semi-quantitative, or quantitative. So it can move across tiers. Our approach to developing indicators is, I guess, very much benchmarked from our UK culture and our UK perspective. And countries do vary. So something that's important for us is we don't want to make numbers just for the sake of it, just for having a number, if really all the number is a value, but the underlying assumptions and how it's derived is actually quite subjective. We also wanted to avoid being prescriptive and saying to people, it's only sustainable remediation if you do X, Y, and Z. Because we are a voluntary initiative and we want to encourage people to take part, we want also to allow people to change the assessment so it fits their own scope for their own purpose. We want to allow service providers and consultants freedom to innovate and sell their own know-how. So different consultants offer different sustainability assessment tools, and we're just giving them an underpinning guidance, if you like, to make sure there's some consistency between those tools. Another thing that we felt was important for our indicators was that any stakeholder who's involved with a contaminated land decision can benchmark a sustainability assessment that they're given against the same set of criteria as the person who developed it. From our perspective, sustainability assessment is subjective and it's specific to stakeholders, projects, and sites. So the idea of having a prescriptive and standardized set of metrics seems a bit nonsensical to us. Now, this is our perspective, and I have to be emphasizing here that different countries see things in different ways. So for some countries, actually quanta and metrics are very much more important, as an example. Now, I mentioned framing and the sustainability assessment, and this is where it comes in. This diagram is a plan, really, of the sustainability assessment process as we see it in SuRF-UK. We think there are three broad stages: to prepare the assessment, to define what you're going to do in detail, and then to carry it out, to execute it. So within preparation, here we're talking about making sure there's a clear and consistent idea of why the decision is being carried out, what the project is, what the constraints and opportunities are, how the assessment is going to be reported, and who's going to be involved. On that basis, you can set out within your definition a clear set of objectives, a clear set of boundaries for the project. You can then decide the scope of the sustainability assessment, which is where the indicators come in, the methodology you will take, and we suggest also how you're going to deal with uncertainty. And on that basis, then you can carry out your assessment, whether it's qualitative, semi-quantitative, or quantitative. We also see this as a bit of an iterative process. So quite often, there's a pilot assessment that's carried out by a small number of stakeholders, and then, if necessary, that's offered for comment to a wider group of stakeholders to make it more robust and more representative. So the rest of this presentation is going to focus here on understanding what the scope of the sustainability assessment is, i.e. what indicators are indicative of sustainability and how those translate into decision criteria. So our first stab at doing this was in 2011. We took a very broad and inclusive frame of reference for what would be included in sustainability, and we divided that across these 15 headline categories that I mentioned to you before, distributed over the environmental, social, and economic elements of sustainability. And we were very deliberate to put 5 in each of those 3 elements, because we want to emphasize that sustainability is a balanced assessment. The bulk of the Annex 1 guidance was then a detailed listing of possible individual indicators within each of those 15 broader categories. And these are the categories that we used in 2011, and we've stuck with them also in the 2020 revision. We took quite a lot of consultation and discussion. We reviewed quite a lot of the international literature that had applied the SuRF-UK indicators. Taking all of that into account, we felt that while we might want to tinker around with the individual indicators and how you specify them and choose them, the broad headline categories that we already had in 2011 were robust, and we would stick with them. So here are a few kind of basic definitions. From our point of view, an indicator is a single characteristic that's representative of a particular aspect of sustainability, and it can be compared across options to evaluate their relative performance. So these indicators need to be measurable or comparable in a way that can allow this evaluation. So comparable includes things like ranking or scoring. It doesn't strictly need to be quantifiable. We use the word metric to apply to an indicator which is actually readily quantifiable. When an indicator becomes a basis for a comparison to support a decision, then clearly it becomes one of the decision-making criteria. We're often asked how much has this framework and process and indicator guidance been used, and in broad terms, across all of SuRF-UK's documents, I think we have had about 45,000 downloads. The framework, which is the underpinning guidance, has had nearly 11,000 downloads. The Annex 1 indicator set has had 6,300 downloads, and we also have some slide-based, PowerPoint-based guidance on processes, and that's also had 6,600 downloads. So that's just to give you an idea of the scale of use. In terms of its use in practice, the SuRF-UK guidance is now explicitly referred to in guidance from different UK regulators. And our estimate is that it's been a consideration in several hundred remediation projects in the UK so far. We published a paper in a journal called Sustainability, where we gave around 20 of those examples in more detail. And we also identified references to our indicator set where it had been used or considered in a wide range of countries around the world, and also different applications, for example, nucleosides. So moving forwards, as I mentioned before, 2018 to 20 was a period of reflection and consultation about this guidance. And in the light of the feedback that we got, we've actually gone a little bit further than we anticipated. So we've produced 2 supplementary reports. We've consolidated our sustainability assessment process guidance in report 1. So by process, I mean the operations, the tasks that you do to carry out the guidance. And we've developed out the indicator guidance in a second report and given a bit more of an explicit set of instructions for how to use them. These should be available in the next couple of weeks. To give you a broad overview of what is in each report, the process-based report discusses the role of sustainability assessment in contaminated land management, the process of gosh, there's a terrible misprint here. The process of sustainability assessment should say preparation, definition, and execution. So I think Dominion is some kind of weird Freudian slip that's going on, and the UK apologises for that to its international audience. Anyway, continuing on, we then give some key points, and there are a bunch of annexes in the report, which we hope will be useful for people. An aid memoir of the steps to carry out the framing and sustainability assessment, a specific qualitative assessment method, because there's not a lot of guidance out there on how you do qualitative sustainability assessment, some more detailed information about carrying out higher tiers, semi-quantitative and quantitative, and an idea of how you could make conceptual site models of sustainability. The second report, which is about the indicators and scope, is really, first of all, it tells you what the functionality of indicators and criteria are in the sustainability assessment process. And then the bulk of the report really is, why did we choose those 15 headline categories and what's in them? So it's a rationale, a series of 3 tables, one for environment, one for economy, and one for society. We go on to explain to you how to use the checklist, and we present the checklist in an annex. And you can download a copy of these slides, so I won't go through these papers for now, but there are a whole bunch of papers that SuRF-UK has published, which you can get from the SuRF-UK website in the same way you can get SuRF papers from the SuRF website. So I'm going to now go through some of these headline categories in a bit more detail. I won't go through all of them because that would make for a very dry talk. But I have gone through all of them actually in the slide deck. So when you download the slides, you can see what's inside each one. One thing that is very striking is that there's environmental element of the headline categories is very similar to the green remediation concept. So I guess that's a process of convergent evolution. And I think it's quite interesting that the indicators we came up for environment are similar to the ones that green remediation has. So our first category is about emissions to air, and within this we include climate change. One point I'll mention on this slide is that for some people climate change is the dominant issue, and in our consultations we were asked, well, why don't you have a headline category that says climate change? Why is it emissions to air? And I guess our answer to that is that climate change is not the only sustainability driver. And our second part of the answer to this is we are just giving a checklist and some guidance to make a platform for you to make a sustainability assessment. You don't have to stick with it. If you want to have 6 headlines in your environmental element and have one for climate change at the very top, that's fine. We're just trying to help the process of including the whole scope of sustainability assessment and not just one factor. We have a number of individual indicators within soil and ground conditions. So where you see these letters on each slide, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, these are actually the individual indicator suggestions that are in that annex of the SuRF-UK guidance. Our indicator suggestions may be disappointing to some people because we don't actually make a very specific suggestion. So for example, our indicator suggestion at A is changes in soil functionality. We're not going to tell you how to assess that. We're not going to say, well, this has to be based on soil catalase activity or soil urease activity or some soil biodiversity measurement. That's entirely up to the project team to decide. We're just reminding you that soil functionality might be quite an important outcome from a remediation process. And that applies really to all of the individual indicator suggestions across these 15 headline categories. And there's quite a wide range of suggestions for water, and something that has changed, for instance, between 2011 and now, is that we're more explicit about coastal environments because there's actually quite a significant issue of risk to coastal brownfields from climate change. So there's a little bit more in there now about possible indicators relating to marine waters. Ecology, this is quite a difficult category for us. There are some very specific tools that can be used, for example, natural capital, which give an ecological value. We're not seeking to replace that. We're simply, as I said before, seeking to remind people what the effects might be of their remediation process. Another aspect that's quite difficult for the ecology indicators is that there's a potential overlap or impacts, for example, on soil functionality that I mentioned to you before, and also outcomes for different water bodies, groundwater and surface water. So another thing that is present in the checklist that we provide in the guidance is that we try and flag where there might be duplications or cross-links. We're not telling you how to manage those, we're just suggesting that they need to be managed. Natural resources, well, this is obviously very strongly aligned with some of the things that you'll be familiar with green remediation. For human health, we have our own particular view that society is made of humans. So things to do with human health risks, we've put in the societal element of sustainability. And a couple of interesting features within here. Clearly, like SuRF, SuRF-UK is very concerned about risks of operations to site workers, neighbours and the public, for instance. The issues that the remediation works might have from process emissions like bioaerosols, from biopiles and allergens. But two other things I think are quite interesting. One is, what if a remediation option actually gives you a higher standard of risk management performance than is demanded by the remediation objectives? That might be quite an interesting thing to take hold of, providing all other things are equal. So we include that idea within this. And a new development for us is that potentially the positive impacts for human health and well-being from redevelopment, remediation of contaminated sites and brownfields. For example, from the provision of amenity, places for people to go, which have proven benefits for public health and public well-being, and also the mitigation of fears that people might have had from the site previously about the release of dread contaminants. So I think these are positives, and I do wonder if in many remediation projects and brownfield projects we forget some of those important positives. For most of the people who responded to our consultation, this category on ethics and equality was the most problematic for them. Most of us in the contaminated land world are not social scientists. We're not people from the humanities. And the idea of ethics seems a bit remote from choosing between whether you're going to excavate and remove or excavate, thermally treat and replace. So we've spent some time in our guidance document, supplementary report 2, explaining why we've included this. I think a very obvious example is our first indicator in this category. How well is the spirit of the polluter pays principle upheld? So what we're trying to say here is the polluter really paying? I think in the US, you probably have more experience than we do in the UK of this of the indicator B, about whether the benefits and impacts are unreasonably shared out to different groups. I've seen many papers from the US looking at concerns for gender, for underprivileged communities, and also the issue of green gentrification. This is very much an emerging discussion in the UK. I'm not sure what's happened to number C, so I'll have to look into that on my slides. Apologies, I think that's probably because it's not existing in the spreadsheet either. So item D is quite an interesting one for us, issues of intergenerational equity. So remediation treatments that destroy contaminants are avoiding the transfer of contamination problem to future generations, whereas containment is perhaps just postponing the problem. So there's quite a lot on this. I've spent quite a lot of time talking on to this slide, so I'll move on to the next one. The next one is perhaps more obvious, and this is the effects of the remediation on neighbourhoods. The only thing extra I'd say, apart from that you can read this slide at your leisure, is that it's not always bad news. There can be improvements in facilities and services that result from projects as well. We've had a hard time distinguishing between that category, SOC 3, and this one, which is to do with communities and community engagement. And so what we've tried to do is to put in the harder, more measurable impacts in the category on neighbourhoods. And in this category, we're really looking at the changes in the way that communities function as a result of a project. This brings me to another point about these indicators in general. Within SuRF-UK, we identified 2 broad stages where decisions might be made. So decisions could be made at the project planning, for example, what the site is going to be used for and how different parts of that use will be parceled off to different bits of the site. And on the basis of that planning, then we set our remediation objectives. We carry out risk assessment for the different uses of those different parcels of land, and we set our remediation assessment. So remediation objectives. So we call that stage A. Stage B, which is kind of where the green remediation world is, not the SuRF world, is, well, we've decided what the remediation objectives are. We know what we're going to use that bit of land for. We know what the thresholds are that the remediation technology has to achieve. So we're simply trying to find the best means of delivery of that outcome. So this we call stage B, and this is closely connected to conventional remediation option appraisal. The indicators that you see through this presentation are serving both stages. So many of them may not be relevant at the level of remediation option appraisal, but they could be certainly relevant in the decisions and plans that you make about how you will use a site, particularly in a brownfields context. The only thing I want to say about SOC 5, which is uncertainty and evidence, is this is to do with the uncertainty and evidence behind the information that we have for the different remediation or project management options under consideration. This is not the same as the uncertainty of the sustainability assessment process itself. For example, different stakeholder opinions and how they impact it. We talk about that in the supplementary report 1, and we suggest sensitivity analysis as a means of addressing that. Within the final element of sustainability, then we have had a lot of discussion about several of these headline categories. And the outcome is that the first category is really looking at economic costs and benefits from a pretty narrow perspective, the primary costs and benefits to those who are initiating the project. However, there may also be wider economic benefits or impacts which are not within that narrow cost benefit assessment. For example, uplift in the property value for parcels surrounding your site, or risks of damage to surrounding property, and a range of other benefits and impacts. We also include the category looking at the impact of the project on employment and employment capital. And if you like, tertiary economic benefits, which we've very opaquely called induced economic changes. So this might be where your remediation project actually facilitates other people coming in and doing more good stuff in an area, but also, for example, giving a chance for a new technology that then becomes a more significant player in the remediation market, or development of innovation and skills. The final category in my talk is this one, project lifespan and flexibility. And in this era where we have to consider climate change resilience, I think this one is particularly important. This considers things like, what's the duration of the remediation benefit? For example, it might be limited in time for a containment system versus a system that is destructive of contaminants. Or potentially some processes take longer for a beneficial outcome to become apparent than others. What factors are affecting the chances of success of the remediation, because that varies from option to option. And how can the project respond to changing circumstances? How can the option respond to changing circumstances? I guess a common one for many of us is the unexpected discovery of additional contamination. And I think I would emphasize, particularly in the light of the developing ITRC guidance, the robustness of the solution to climate change effects. But there's several other project lifespan indicators that we've included there as well. So within the checklist that comes with this guidance, we list these possible individual indicators or criteria in the way that I've just shown you. We also suggest the lines of evidence that could be used to support a comparison. I apologize again, because you might find those suggestions are rather vague, but we're trying to give a hint rather than give something that people might simply just cut and paste and say we did this. we would rather that sustainability assessments engage the grey matter as well. We show the cross references to all of the different headline categories, and we also cross-reference each of our headline categories to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and show what the linked Sustainable Development Goal wordings are. So that's basically what's in Sustainable Remediation, sorry, Supplementary Report 2. We offer a process for selecting indicators. It's very simple. You consider whether each criterion or indicator is relevant. You don't just base that on your own opinion, but on what you think the shared view of the different stakeholders interested in the project is. We cannot possibly have guessed all possible indicators. So at this point, you may feel that you need to add a few. And then you document your decisions. Why have you decided some things are included and some things are not? So you can explain that in a transparent way. You might then want to finalize your set of suggestions, because this is basically the scope of your sustainability assessment, whether it's a scoring-based system, a ranking-based system, or a quantitative system. You might want to tinker around with it to make it a bit more specific. As I've said to you, our suggestions are not specific, deliberately not specific. And decide what are the lines of evidence that you're going to use to support your comparisons. So to conclude, and I hope I've not overrun here, our opinion in SuRF-UK is that there's not one light and truth that defines how sustainability assessment should be carried out. And we are offering guidance, voluntary guidance. We're not suggesting obligation and prescription. Take what we offer, use what is useful. When we've made this offer, it is in a particular structure, a logical structure that you can follow and use. But the structure can determine outcome, as I mentioned before. The example of climate change that we don't have as a separate headline category, but somebody might feel it should be. So it's open for other users to introduce different headlines, demote others, structure it differently to our table of 5 + 5 + 5. You just have to record what you do in a way that's transparent to all the stakeholders who will be involved with your sustainability assessment or who will be using it afterwards. Clearly, we've designed our approach with the UK in mind, but we hope that it has sufficient flexibility that it can be used elsewhere. But how it's used, as I've mentioned before, depends on the regulatory and policy context in the country and culture. And you can't really understate that. People in different countries do things differently. Where we are firm in our opinion is that we think there is no such thing as an objective sustainability assessment. There's no kilograms or meters cubed of sustainability. Some components of it simply cannot be quantified. Many components on it depend on values from stakeholders, and it's always subject to the context of the site and the project. So that's the end. Oh, look, here's this animation again, which you might want to have a look at. Thank you very much for your patience and forbearance. Any questions, please ask. And maybe a cheeky discussion point here is anything that I've said of relevance to SuRF or the USA more generally? Thanks, Kyle, and over to you.
Thanks, Paul. That was a great presentation, and we've already got some questions rolling in. For our Q&A, Paul is going to be joined by his colleagues, Nicola Jerez and Haley Thomas. If y'all want to jump on as well, unmuting yourselves and turning on your video if you're able. We do have some questions coming in, but there's still lots of time. So if you have a question, you can submit that through the questions toolbar. And the first question I think that is probably on everybody's mind is, when does this guidance come out and where can we find it?
Nicola,
do you want me to answer? Yeah, it is being worked on. The final publication version is being worked on, so it will be out within the next 2 weeks, and it will be on the SuRF-UK website. It'll be identified where the Annex 1 was. So you've got the top frame. It's talking about framing sustainability assessment, and at the top it'll have the actual framework, and next door to it will have the indicator SR1, SR2. We will maintain the old Annex 1, but we will identify that it's been withdrawn, but people can still access it. But we'll have SR1 and SR2 very, very visible.
Awesome, and that's for public download. You don't have to be a member of anything to access that.
Public download, yeah. And we'll also obviously send details to everybody as soon as it's live.
Well, we're really looking forward to that. The next question that I had is about how much effort does it take to go through this process? You talked about the different stakeholders, but how many people have to be involved? How many stakeholders do you involve? And then how many of those 15 indicators do you need to use?
Do you want to answer that, Paul?
I was going to invite Hayley if she wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, I'll take a first stab. So I think the thing about this sort of the SuRF-UK approach that we hope everybody will realise is that we've built it with it in mind that it's quite flexible, and it's a tiered approach. So what Paul didn't talk about, because this was mainly about indicators, but that we recommend starting with a qualitative, moving then to a semi-quantitative, and then to a quantitative. So it's this tiered approach, but with this framing process up front, which is the same regardless of the tier that you're looking at, that allows you to kind of scale the assessment based on basically making it fit for purpose and the need of the project. So if it's a simple project, then it can be a simple assessment and it doesn't have to have lots of stakeholders. And I think if that's the case, it's typically, the consultant writing it, the client, perhaps the regulator if they're involved. And then as projects get more complicated, then it becomes more necessary to kind of involve more stakeholders and more people. Does that answer the question? I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Paul.
I was simply going to add that it can be quite iterative as well. So I know that on some of the assessments that Shell has done, you begin the assessment process with quite a narrow focus group, with the site manager and consultant and maybe somebody else, and develop out a first stab, if you like, of the sustainability assessment, trying to think in advance of what all the different stakeholder interests might have. And then from that point, you go to perhaps the local authority or the regulator and invite them in to comment on the process, because it's quite difficult to get all stakeholders involved with a blank piece of paper right at the very start. In terms of the amount of time, I'm doing some sustainability assessments at the moment for a European project, which is a phytoremediation project. And this first stage, with just a narrow focus group, is probably taking 2 or 3 web meetings and maybe 5 working days of effort.
Okay, thank you. Another question from the audience: to what extent has the SuRF-UK project team benchmarked their proposed indicator categories against ISO 18504 2017, which is the sustainable remediation guidance? Is that something the team has looked at?
Yes, because the ISO guidance took their suggested headlines from us in the first place. So there's a very close alignment. So you'll actually see a very similar table in the ISO guidance. The ISO guidance develops it out in different directions because there are different countries involved, but the basic framing of the headline categories is the same. Nicola, do you want to add anything?
Oh, you're on mute, I think, Nicola.
Sorry, I'm trying to. We're sharing an office. It's home working. It's lovely. Yes, no. So there is a duplication of the indicator and the categories. So there is a direct crossover. So there is no problem there. We've obviously gone into a lot more details explaining about the different categories, and that's what the SR1 and SR2 will hopefully help you with.
Thank you. That's really interesting, and I'm glad the two hands are talking to each other and working together. Another question we received: some of the indicators seem relevant to choosing the most sustainable remediation option. Some are more about the scope of the overall project and its sustainability, however that may be defined. Is that a fair reflection, or do you think that all the proposed indicators are relevant to sustainable remediation?
I think that's an absolutely fair reflection, and it's because the SuRF-UK framework recognises both the project planning stage and the remediation option appraisal stage. So this is stage A, which is the project planning, and the remediation option appraisal, which is stage B. And sometimes there's overlap between them, but not all indicators that have been suggested are going to be relevant to all sites and all options. Hayley, do you want to add any?
No, I totally agree with what you said, and I think just to again reiterate that the way that we've tried to develop this is to make it flexible and that people should be able to select their own indicators for the project. So it might be that not all indicators are appropriate, but it's up to the assessor to kind of do that assessment to make sure that the indicators that they're using are relevant.
And I would just say that's when Paul referenced a checklist, it isn't specifically a checklist, but it is a good way of having an aid memoir, having that list as Hayley says as a starting point, and then saying, well, actually that's not appropriate for my project, that's not appropriate. So you can then put that aside and then start from there, from your condensed number that you're going to use for your project. But it just helps you go through the thought process. I think that's the important aspect and why you're discarding it.
And this is all explained in SR2, you know, this process. I think as long as this deciding what is in your scope is recorded and transparent, then that's all anybody can really ask of a project.
And would it be appropriate to say that the documentation is a really large portion of that? I know that's something that we run into in the States, is these conversations are had and the analysis is done, but it's not documented, and so it, in essence, didn't occur. I think you had that on a slide or two back.
This is a good and a difficult question, and I think to some extent this might represent differences between the UK and the USA. So what an assessor might do in the UK is he might be recording the different opinions, particularly for a qualitative assessment, as the assessor goes along, and saying that and identifying whether divergences of opinion, for example, that you might want to explore in detail later on. I think the more you move up the tier of sustainability assessment, when you start to get to scoring methods or quantitative methods, then the better your evidential basis has to be. But I understand that from Shell's perspective, a large number of decisions can be quite robust just on the basis of a qualitative assessment. So coming back to the point of how much effort does it take, well, if you have a clear leader, if you like, from your remediation or project options on the basis of a qualitative assessment, why go to anything more complicated?
Yeah, absolutely, that's a good point. I think this next question might also get at some of the differences between the UK and the United States. Resilience and the relationship between resilience and sustainability is really a blooming topic in the States. You mentioned, Paul, the upcoming IPRC guidance, and it doesn't appear that resilience is specifically included in these new guidelines, although there of course is some mention of climate change. Where does the UK stand on resilience? What's going on in that field, and do you think it'll be included maybe in a future version of this?
Betsy, it is explicitly included in the category Econ 5. That's resilience by another name, but that's essentially what is in there, is the long-term outcome and flexibility of the solution that's being offered. And I think it is an emerging question in the UK, but it hasn't had the leadership yet that the ITRC has applied to it in the USA. But perhaps Hayley and Nicola might want to add to that answer.
I mean, there's quite a lot of research going on in the UK regarding sea level rising and exposure of a lot of landfills, this sort of thing, and flooding. So resilience is high up on the political agenda. The funding for our regulator is very much on the flooding side of things. So it is something that we are starting to address at vast costs as well.
Well, thank you so much again, Nicola, Hayley, and Paul. Since we're nearing the top of the hour, I want to pass it back over to Kyle to do our final wrap up. But I want to let you know we received a bunch of comments thanking you and expressing interest from both the US and the UK. So I know this will be hotly downloaded once it becomes available. And we just really appreciate you being here today and giving this presentation. Kyle, over to you.
Could we thank you as well for the opportunity? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul.
So thank you everybody for your time today. I think that was a fantastic talk, and it had some great discussion points. So if necessary, there's a copy of the presentation and a SuRF brochure attached as handouts to the GoToWebinar function. Again, feel free to visit our website for tons of great information. Go ahead and sign up to be a SuRF member if you have not already, and please visit the SuRF-UK website to get their guidance once it's out and get the previous guidances. If you missed any part of the webinar, or if your colleagues did, feel free to refer them to our SuRF YouTube channel. You can find the webinar will be posted there, along with some of our past webinars. We've had some really good ones. Next slide, Paul. We do have some upcoming webinars. So there will be, the next one will be a case study on transitioning from active to passive remediation through refining the CSM. We have another one on the feasibility of using greenhouse gas emission offsets for natural source zone depletion. And finally, a presentation from our own SuRF VP on combined technologies at complex sites. So keep an eye out for information and actual dates for those. And then I'll make a final plug for AEHS. SuRF partners with AEHS, and we host a number of sustainable remediation related topics. So look out for information on the fall AEHS conference that is coming up this October. And if you have any topic, even non-sustainable remediation related, they are accepting abstracts for their spring conference up through July 1st. So feel free to check out the AHS website for more information on that. And then lastly, last slide, we'd like to thank our sponsors. They enable us to continue to do things like bring you these types of webinars. So a big thank you to them, and a special thank you to TriHydro for doing much of the behind the scenes work in setting up these webinars and hosting them on their platform. And so with that, we look forward to having you back at our next presentation. Look out for an email describing that. Thank you.